The purpose of this screencast is twofold. First, I will be reading pages 181 to 187 in the Northern Lights textbook, and it is on the aftermath of the U.S.-Dakota War. You will also be taking notes while you listen to this screencast, and the notes you are taking are on the impact the war had on the Dakota, the impact the war had on government officials, and the impact the war had on the settlers. Let's preview this using path. So pictures, this is Fort Ridgely, and you can see the destruction after the war. And then destruction of war, we'll be reading about that, where it talks about the totality of the destruction. Here is where the hearings were held, where Dakota men were put on trial during the war, and you can see some Dakota men as well as U.S. soldiers, and then these are Dakota men here waiting to be put on trial. Then we get into the aftermath of the war. Bishop Henry Whipple will be somebody who is perhaps mentioned, a missionary. And then this particular document that you see here is a letter, I believe, to Sibley telling Henry Sibley the people that are to be hanged in Mankato, so the 38. And then we talk about exile. And this term means to be removed from your home or banned from your home, so removed from it and then not allowed to come back. And they got this interesting word, so terms, internment camp. A lot of Dakota call this internment camp a concentration camp, and that's a place very different than an internment camp, because that's where systematic extermination or killing can go on. So the use of language is important. And here is the concentration camp at Fort Snelling. This image is pretty important because this is the route that was taken by the Dakota when they were removed from Minnesota. You can see they went down the Mississippi River to where the Mississippi River meets the Missouri, then up the Missouri River to Crow Creek, which is in South Dakota, and that is a reservation that a lot of Dakota were moved to as they were removed from the state of Minnesota. And then we'll talk about some longer term effects that occurred because of the U.S.-Dakota War. So a changing landscape. Minnesota is changing. All right, we'll start the reading on page 181 in the Northern Lights textbook. And while I read, you are either responsible for taking notes on the impact the war had on the Dakota, farm and traditional, or you're taking notes on the impact that the war had on the settlers or on government officials. So you're listening for those. The trickiest one tends to be government officials, and that's really anybody in the government. What role did they play after the war in the decisions that they had to make? So it could be Abraham Lincoln, it could be Sibley, or it could be anybody that was in the government, but those are some big names that are mentioned. All right, destruction of war. 9 days after fighting began, Colonel Henry Sibley, the former Minnesota governor, led more than 1,400 soldiers into the prairie to battle the Dakota. Soon it became clear to many Dakota that they could not win. By the end of September, the U.S.-Dakota War was over. The Dakota had been defeated in a final battle at Wood Lake on September 23rd. Over 2,000 surrendered to Sibley's forces. Many hundreds more fled from Minnesota to avoid capture, including Little Crow and some of his followers. The war had taken a tremendous toll on the region's people and landscape. Just over 70 U.S. soldiers and between 75 and 100 Dakota soldiers had been killed. More than 500 settlers had been killed, most in raids by the Dakota in the first week of the war. Hundreds of farms were left empty as 20,000 settlers fled for safety. Towns like New Ulm were devastated. There, dozens of buildings were burned and hundreds of residents were left wounded or homeless. This destruction would affect southern Minnesota for years as people struggled to rebuild their lives. While settlers rebuilt, the Dakota, including those who had not fought in the war, were to suffer terrible consequences. So just to pause for a second, we have some information certainly about government officials up here. And you can even include soldier activity in government officials. You also have information about the outcome for Dakota people as well as settlers. The aftermath. That fall, Colonel Sibley set up a military court to judge the hundreds of Dakota that his men had taken prisoner. He set up this court in the kitchen of one of the Lower Sioux Agency's trading houses. The judges were a panel of Army officers who just days before had fought in the Dakota War. They rushed through dozens of cases each day. The Dakota defendants often were brought to court chained together in groups. Like some other military trials of the period, they had no lawyers to present their case. The missionary Stephen Riggs, who had worked for years among the Dakota, was troubled by what he considered a rush to judgment. This is according to Riggs. I dislike the way the trials were conducted, he wrote. If the Indians have done wickedness, they should have something like a fair trial, even for our own sake. So the trials that were held, that certainly impacted groups of people. Unlike Riggs, most Minnesotans supported the trials. Outraged by the war, most settlers wanted to see the Dakota punished. Dakota soldiers had killed hundreds of people. Many survivors had been forced to witness the deaths of their friends and families. Most Minnesotans demanded revenge. Newspapers such as the Faribault Central Republican expressed it this way: extermination, swift, sure, and terrible, is the only thing that can give the people of Minnesota satisfaction or a sense of security. The military court took 39 days to sentence 303 Dakota men to death. The convicted men were marched to a new military camp near Mankato. Under U.S. law, none of those men could be executed or killed without the approval of President Abraham Lincoln. At the urging of Minnesota missionary Henry Whipple, Lincoln's staff reviewed the cases. And here is Whipple here. And obviously he wanted the cases reviewed so that 303 would not be put to death. The more Lincoln learned, the more troubled he felt. In November, he met with Whipple, who described the terrible conditions on the reservations prior to the war and asked the president to show mercy. In the end, Lincoln approved the execution of 39 Dakota who had been convicted of crimes against civilians. On the morning of December 26, 1862, in front of a large crowd in Mankato's public square, 38 of the Dakota selected by Lincoln were hanged. One man, Roundwind, or Ta-te-mi-ma, was spared at the last minute. It was the largest mass execution in U.S. history before or since. President Lincoln ordered the rest of the convicted men be moved from Mankato to a military prison camp in Iowa called Camp McClellan. While in prison there, more than 120 of the nearly 300 Dakota men died as a result of poor conditions. Here is the letter to Sibley saying the 38. Exile. which is to be banned from your home, so not to return after being removed. After the war, the U.S. government believed it was not safe for the Dakota to stay in Minnesota. Although many had fled after the war, nearly 2,000 Dakota men, women, and children were in the custody of Sibley's army. The convicted men went to Mankato to be held until their cases were reviewed. The U.S. government decided to force the rest of the Dakota, including many who did not participate in the attacks, to leave their homeland. About 1,700 Dakota women, children, and elders were forced to travel just over 100 miles from the Lower Sioux Agency to an internment camp or concentration camp on the riverbanks below Fort Snelling. An internment camp is a place where civilians, prisoners of war, and/or political prisoners are held. Many feel that it's a concentration camp because it's a place where they went to die and systematically be killed. The march was hard and dangerous. Despite being guarded by U.S. soldiers, the Dakota were attacked by settlers as they passed through the town of Henderson. At least one Dakota child was killed on the march, and several were injured. The 4-mile-long group of wagons, animals, and people arrived at Fort Snelling on November 23, 1862. What's not mentioned in here is that they didn't just go through a town like Henderson where they experienced the anger of settlers towards them. They really marched through several towns. All those towns were affected by the war. And as a result, the people that lived in those towns were very upset with the Dakota and mistreated them as they were walking and marching towards Fort Snelling. The conditions at Fort Snelling were difficult. The Dakota were encamped on the river banks surrounded by a wooden wall. They were guarded and fed by U.S. soldiers. At times they received permission to gather wood and fish outside the camp, but this could be risky. There were many people still angry about the war, and several Dakota were attacked and killed. Measles and other diseases were also spreading that winter. This affected both the Dakota and many settlers who fled to St. Paul during the war. Overall, between 100 and 200 Dakota died from disease, illness, and attacks during the miserable winter of 1862 to 1863. And here is the Dakota concentration camp at Fort Snelling. And it's right below Fort Snelling on kind of water level. This route down the Mississippi to where it meets the Missouri River, and then heading up the Missouri River to Crow Creek is going to be important. So you can see it's a pretty long journey all the way through Iowa down to Missouri, and then back up through Missouri, through Nebraska, and up to South Dakota. By early 1863, the U.S. government had canceled all treaties they had signed with the Dakota in Minnesota. The reservation and the annuities were gone. The Dakota would be forced to leave the state. In the spring, those who had survived the winter in the internment camp were exiled. Steamboats, barges, and trains carried more than 1,500 Dakota on rivers and over land to a reservation at Crow Creek in what is now South Dakota. It was a desolate place, and food was scarce. The government sent food, but it was never enough and almost always came late. Hundreds of Dakota died from hunger and disease. The missionary John P. Williamson, who had worked with the Dakota in Minnesota, went to visit. He was appalled by the conditions there. He called Crow Creek a desert, a place that was totally unfit for the habitation of any human being. In 1866, the government finally let the exiled Dakota move to a new reservation in Nebraska. The land was better there than it had been in South Dakota, but it was nothing like home. It was not Minnesota. A changing landscape. In the summer of 1863, hardly anyone lived in southwestern Minnesota. Nearly all the settlers in the region had abandoned their homes during the war. Most of the Dakota either fled from the state or been exiled. Only about 200 Dakota who had helped the settlers during the war were allowed to stay. As the years went by, the Dakota remained separated. Many chose to stay on reservations in Nebraska, North Dakota, and South Dakota, and Canada. Many others, however, wanted to return home to Minnesota. Within a few years, some of the Dakota who had been forced to leave their homeland returned to live alongside their relatives who had been allowed to stay in Minnesota. Beginning in the 1880s, these Dakota worked with the U.S. government to establish new communities at the old Upper and Lower Sioux agencies, at Prairie Island and at Prior Lake. Notice they're called communities, they are not reservations. By the time they established these communities, though, the Dakota could hardly recognize the land they had lived on for generations. It had changed forever. Tens of thousands of new settlers had moved to Minnesota, intent on farming the land in the European American style. This ends the screencast.